All right, let's take a look at how to use curl to actually test one of these things. I have over here in the server directory already run the server in the main. So it's up and running right now. And let's look at a file that I've already built that has the instruction in it, the curl command to actually run something. And I'm going to break down the URL first, and then we're going to talk about what's going to happen. First of all, I'm not using secure sockets, it's just HTTP. Then // to start the URL. I've done something that you don't commonly see these days because it's bad security, but I've put in a username and password in the URL. It saves having to figure out how to do headers in the communication is all it does. But it's not a very high security. But this is just enough security for us to test with. And then it says @ and it uses the IP address of the computer. That's my 192.168.0.44 that you would have to change for your computer or use localhost. And then a colon, and then it has the port number. And this is the port that the server by default is running on. And then it has this path after it that says what the command is that I want to go and access. That's the communication endpoint on the receiver. So if I just run this, okay, I get back a list of the accounts. The server went and looked at that account and username and said, yeah, they look like a valid username and PIN. And then it went out and ran that account list, which I can also run by just running the wallet client. This is the same thing as test2 here. That's this one right here. That's what I'm going to run. And you see the same kind of output, except that's inside the Go program. So let's go look at the server and see where it is that got run. So I'm going to go over to the server side and look in the code and go find something in the code that says how it actually ran this. And we know it's running as a server, so it's got that flag set. And it calls this function run server. Let's go look at what happens in run server. And run server has some handlers for different communication endpoints. One of them is this API list account or account list. And when that happens, it calls this function, respond handler account list. So let's look at get resp handler account list, wherever that is. Okay, and here's the function that happens when this runs. Now, it does something with a closure to return a function. That's the return. But the function that gets run is this guy right here. So look in here. It says that it's going to send back a header with a content of application JSON. So it's sending back JSON data. That's the little square bracket and stuff that we saw come back. It validates the username and password for that account. Remember, the URL had a username and password in it. And then it does this call to list accounts JSON, which returns some sort of a string. Okay. And for some reason that I have no earthly clue, it sets the header again. Probably a mistake in the code, but not a fatal one because it just resets it. And then it writes this string out to the response, which is that www. The response writer. So basically it just does a print on response writer with whatever that string is. So the function that gets called is this list accounts JSON function. And it is in server lib. Here it is right here. So list accounts JSON. It makes a map. It says, goes in the index and it finds the list of accounts that have value to them. And then it turns around and uses this library function to turn it into JSON and serialize it and return it. So basically it just gives you a list of the accounts. So we've got at the bottom level in the server a function that returns a string. We take that string and we process that to be the JSON response by adding a header and writing it out when we get that communication endpoint. So that's kind of the path between the two programs. Now, when we go to a little bit more complicated stuff, like we want to actually send some parameters, let's look at one of those. Okay. This one validates a signed message, which it takes a message, signs it, sends it to the server, and the server says, yeah, this is a valid signature or not, given the information I've got from you. Okay, we expect to get either success, signature validated. Ah, look, that came from our other code where it said signature validated, that we looked at the command line, or get back a status error in the JSON output. So that's what we're expecting, is something that looks like that. So let's actually run this once, and then we'll take a look at the URL and see what it's sending. Okay, so it gives us back our expected output. Let's take a look at the URL. Okay, so we've got HTTP, same as before. We've got a username and password that we're passing in an insecure fashion. We have an IP address, that's where the server is running. We have a port number that we're talking to. We've got this API validate signed message communication endpoint. We can go find that in the server and see where it's at. And then we've got a series of parameters. Parameters start with a question mark, okay, and are separated from each other with an ampersand sign that you see way over here. So the first one is account equals some hex value, then signature equals some much longer hex value, and eventually we get down to message equals and this piece out here. So those are the pieces that we're actually building. Now, that's what we send, and we know what we're expecting to get back. So when we build the code, what we want to do is we want to have some function in there that can build that URL that we can send to the server. And fortunately, I wrote one of those for you. In client main, it's called doGet. And you'll notice that there are examples of calling it with different things. Okay. All the time it gets past some sort of an URL that I format with this host with unpw to get the URL. So that must be the username and password. So down here where you're actually going to be implementing your code, you're going to be doing these functions like instructor validate signed message with account and password, or send funds. You implement those two things to test your signature signing process. Those guys, inside them, need to have a call to this in the same sort of way, where you're going to build an URL string, you're going to call doGet, and it's going to respond. So let's look at list accounts. List accounts calls that API, which we saw from the test case, looks like what we call, and then we call doGet. doGet is a function that has a variable number of parameters. And let's look at how this actually gets implemented. Here's the implementation for the validate signed message. And you notice it got past the account and password from the command line. And it goes out and asks for a password, get passphrase. That comes from the command line stuff, but it's also in here, basically just copied. And then it creates just a message of 20 random bytes. So it's just creating an arbitrary message. Generate signature came copied strictly from the command line stuff as is, function unchanged. And then it builds this communication endpoint, validate signed message with the host username and password. There's the doGet, and you notice it passes the combined URL, and then it passes the name that it wants, account with the account, signature with a signature, and message over here with a message. So it's taking pairs of values, first the name and then the value, and it's going to build that into the final URL. And when it gets back, what we're looking for is that the status value is 200. A status of 200 indicates that the server had success. And if it had success, then it turns around and it just prints out the body of whatever that success message was. If it wasn't a 200, it prints out the status code to say, by golly, I didn't have success, I had an error. So it prints out an error and this decimal status to say whatever the error was. You need to know a little bit about HTTP errors. 404, I think most people have seen it at some point, means you talked to something that wasn't a correct communication endpoint. So if you misspelled validate, for example, here, it would give you back a 404. It would also give you back a 404 if you don't have the server running. It will time out and give you a 404. Or if you ran the server on a different port, or if you don't have the correct IP address of the server. So any of these failure to communicate. Most of the others in our case are going to come back as something on the order of a status of 500, which means that it didn't correctly communicate or didn't validate for something like this. So this is kind of the layout of how you do the validate and what has to go into the validate. So there are a bunch of different things, this is back in the main program, that you can send in as commands, like shutdown server or server status, which gives you back a server status, and these are all built. The two that you have to build, you just looked at the code for this one, okay, and you get to build the send funds to, okay. I'm going to send out a pseudocode for what goes in that here in just a little bit. And those are the two pieces for this, which allows you to actually do the signature and send in a signature and get it validated and back. Once you have those done, the thing to turn in for the homework is the two pieces of code for these two functions, or build the functions inline. You could put them right in here. You don't have to build separate functions in a separate file.